it's a new dark age, right? That was the feature of the old dark age, was that there was a high clerisy that could just unerringly distinguish truth from falsity, and suppress falsities for the benefit of the public at large. Right, that is the age we are currently living in.
Yeah, well, it's a degenerate theocracy, right? But the running itself under the guise of a kind of rampant secularism. It's really something to see, and it's so interesting. Maybe we could touch on this in a minute. I knew 10 years ago that the woke types in the universities would go after the STEM fields, and everyone thought at that point that I was being conspiratorial and paranoid. And I thought, no, I know how scientists work. Most of them are obsessively focused on their narrow specialization. That's not an insult. That's their job. That's their job, is to be 80 hours a week focused on that specific issue, to understand it deeply and communicate that to the rest of us. More power to them. But it means that they don't have a political bone in their body, especially the real scientists, especially in STEM. And so when the woke political mob of narcissists comes for them, they won't have a hope of resisting. And, well, obviously that's exactly what's happening. In the California system now, UCal system, 80% of applicants to STEM positions are rejected on the basis of inadequate diversity, inclusivity, and equity statements. You see that Texas yesterday, University of Texas, revoked its commitment to requiring DIE statements as a precondition for employment, and then of course denied that they ever had such a policy in place to begin with.
I mean, they're just the de facto loyalty oaths. I mean, that's essentially
definitely
what they are. Like I mean, it's a statement of faith that you belong to this particular faith tradition.
Yep.
With documented by the DEI statements. I mean, I think it's one of these things where, like, I never imagined that the free countries of the West would come to a situation where the basic civil rights, checks and balances of power, all these like norms of liberal civilization that I thought everyone agreed with, were actually in question. I mean, you saw it earlier than most. I certainly, before the pandemic, I would have thought of them as annoying, but I wouldn't have thought of them as an existential threat. And now I've really come around.
Yeah. Well, the other thing we could think about too here is that we don't want to underestimate the pervasive attractiveness of this set of ideas. I mean, it devastated Eastern Europe, Russia, and China. And that's still going on in China. It's still going on in North Korea. I mean, these are attractive ideas. They promise universal brotherhood. They promise an egalitarianism that is not only impossible to produce, but would be horrible in its realization, but that looks on the surface extraordinarily attractive. They appeal to a kind of domestic ethos too. Ben Shapiro said to me one time, he said, well, at home, I'm a communist. And what he meant by that was that in his family, he has children, it's to each according to his need and from each according to his ability. And that might work perfectly well in the domestic environment, in a limited manner. But as a scalable political enterprise, it's a complete bloody disaster. It's not obvious why. It's just obvious that that's the case. And, when I grew up, we had the Soviet Union as evil example of this woke pseudo-communist ideology, and that kept everybody in check, but that threat diminished substantially in 1989, and it allowed these ideas to hold sway once again in the West, aided and abetted by idiot intellectuals, especially on the literary criticism front. But that's just pervaded the institutions of higher education like mad. But we need to give the devil his due. I mean, these ideas hold sway over the minds of hundreds of millions of people, because they offer attractiveness on the utopian front that's not easy for conservatives or classical liberals or scientists to mitigate against, with their insistence on individual autonomy and responsibility and the importance of tradition and the necessity of rational inquiry.
Even communities, like, I think communities are incredibly important, like thick communities where people are embedded and they draw support. Like, even people who think like that should be opposed to these ideas, because these ideas destroy communities. We need to have checks. I mean, let's go back to our discussion about lockdowns. What did lockdowns do other than destroy communities? It's not an individual thing to say, individualistic to say that lockdowns are a bad idea. They destroy the communities that provide support for the poor.
Right. And the poorest communities, well, the other thing too is that, look, for all you leftists who are listening, all 15 of you, and this is why I like people like Russell Brand and to some degree Joe Rogan. It's like, why do you believe, if you're on the left, that fascist collusion at the highest levels of power is going to serve the communities that you might even rightly be attempting to serve? You know, the genuine leftists, and I've known many in my life, say labor leader types, you know, who are trying to give a real voice to the working class, and that's a necessary thing to do, and to push back against the gigantism and excess of the corporate world. That's a valid thing to do. Why in the world would you think that this top-down collusion between government, state, and media is in the interests of the people that you purport to serve? It's a preposterous notion.
I've encountered many people on the left, like the honest left, who joined the anti-lockdown movement. Sunetra Gupta, who wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, for instance, is famously on the left. So I think that there is a tradition within the left that is solidly devoted to basic liberal ideas, just as there is on the right. And I think that's the coalition that will win. And the lockdowns, the whole strategy we followed to drive the pandemic at least for me, has just brought me to a realization about how unimportant other kinds of political designations are. You know, Democrat, liberal, Democrat, Republican. I mean, really, the key unifying thing is this. This devotion, this commitment to checks and balances. A commitment to sort of enlightenment ideals, a commitment to religious tolerance, to freedom of speech.
And freedom of speech and conscience probably foremost among those. And I think foremost because, as far as I can tell, all the other processes that keep systems of good governance in place are dependent, how could it be otherwise, on freedom of conscience, thought, and speech. Because that's the mechanism by which complex problems are solved. And so if you give up that mechanism, that's the mechanism of thought itself. And I mean, what we're doing today, well, both of us are trying to update our views of the world to some degree, as well as to communicate with other people. But that's all part of the process of analysis, diagnosis, and repair of systems that have gone astray. And unless you can engage in that freely, then